Howdy, howdy, folks. Bill here from CoolWildlife.com, and I am thrilled to have Steven Kersting with me from SharpshooterIndustries.com. He's probably one of the most technical guys that I know when it comes to the Nikon system. Why? Because he's got 35 years of experience in the field, and for whatever reason, this guy can go deeper than anyone I know in a technical discussion. And so when the Nikon 800 PF lens dropped, I wanted to have a conversation with him to help you make a decision on what's the best lens for wildlife photography, budget aside. And so we're going to have a discussion with regards to high resolution cameras like the Nikon Z7II and Z9, those 46 megapixel cameras. And when they're paired with long focal lenses, what the limitations are. You really need to understand it before you make a purchase, so stay tuned. Before we get rolling with Steven, if you want to help support the channel, I'm going to have 2 affiliate links in the description of this video, one for the Topaz Labs image quality bundle and the other for B&H. If you're buying gear from B&H or software from Topaz, it'd be greatly appreciated if you'd click on those links when you make your purchase. It does kick off a small commission to the channel, and much appreciated. Thank you. Good morning, Steven. I'm interrupting your coffee.
No worries.
No worries. Hey, I wanted to have a conversation with you quickly with regards to this buzz around the 800 PF lens from Nikon that just dropped.
Yep.
So I've been watching a lot of reviews. You've got Rishi Chera from Nikon Europe, Steve Perry from Backcountry Gallery, shooting wildlife with this handheld and getting 1/200th of a second and 1/30th. In Rishi's case, I think I saw in his video, handheld with an 800 millimeter lens, which is phenomenal. And I even polled my YouTube community, and there's only 7% of people that were going to use this on a tripod. Everybody else was also going to handhold this lens. That's what they're going to use it for. And so I wanted to have the conversation with you because I think you have an alternate viewpoint on why this might not be the best pairing for these high resolution cameras like the Z7II and Z9. And you're the most technical scientific data guy I know. So I wanted to go all geek squad with you this morning and just have a conversation on why this might not be the best lens to be paired with high resolution sensors, what other options might be better, because I don't take this lens lightly. It's $6,500 US and $8,500 Canadian. It requires some decision making, right?
Sure.
So that's the conversation I wanted to have with you this morning. And I know you've got some suggestions for folks, or at least considerations before you purchase.
Yeah, I would say considerations is more accurate. Like the first consideration is what subjects are you going to take pictures of at 800 millimeters that are suitable to low shutter speeds where image stabilization helps. Most of things I photograph with long lenses is wildlife, which tends to move around a lot. And, IBIS VR, it doesn't help with that. So the ability to handhold at low shutter speeds due to image stabilization is largely offset by what subjects you might be photographing. So that's the first consideration, I would say. And then the next consideration, I think the first thing people need to understand is all lenses get the same light. They all see the same scene. They see what you see with your eyes. You're all in the same place. The only thing a lens does is crop that field of view down to whatever its focal length is, and then magnifies it plus or minus so it fills the image circle, covers the sensor. So the extra magnification, it's not like you got closer to the subject. It's not like the details were presented larger to the lens. It's not nearly the same as getting closer to a subject using a longer lens.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say, I mean, first order of business then, if you can, is with whatever lens you're shooting with, is get closer to your subject. Tip number
image
one.
quality, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
And if you're closer, you don't need as high a quality a lens to get the same kind of resolution results because the details are presented larger to the lens.
Right.
So it's just goes back to the whole fieldcraft thing. Fieldcraft comes in before equipment.
Right.
The other thing I guess to understand is all lenses are limited by diffraction, which is determined by the aperture.
Okay, you want to dumb that down for us?
A lens takes a detail, a point of light,
yeah,
and then records that as a point of light on the sensor. The size of that point of light on the sensor is determined by diffraction. And on the left here, you have various apertures, and you have the different formats, camera size, and you have the different wavelengths of light. All right.
Yep.
And based on diffraction, the most, let's go to 5.6. The most red wavelengths, most megapixels you can record at f5.6 is 38 in red wavelengths due to diffraction. And this is given one area disc, one point of light covering 2 pixels on the sensor.
Okay, so no matter what camera I'm using a Z9 at 45 megapixels. The best I can get out of a 5.6 lens is 38 megapixels.
That's correct. And it doesn't matter the focal length of the lens either.
Right.
Okay. But that's only in the red wavelengths.
Yeah. Okay.
You got twice as many pixels that are green sensitive,
yeah,
which you're at 60 megapixels there. So you're still doing pretty good.
Yes.
All right. By f8, we're down to 29. All right. But we're still at f8, we still get 57 in blue wavelengths, but we're down below our 46 megapixels at 5.6 in the reds. Still doing good in greens, still doing good in blues, but
yeah,
greens are most important for us.
So now if I take that 800 millimeter lens at 6.3, which is somewhere in between the 5.6 and the f8.
Yeah, it's 1/3 stop. About.
Yeah,
so that would put you right around probably 40, 45. So in the greens. So right there at what the D8, Z9, D850, Z7 want and can use. But you're still down. You're losing quite a bit in the reds then.
Right.
Now, that's not to say you need that much resolution. You generally do not. But the point of this is when you go from a 400-2.8 to a 600-4 to an 800-5.6, you're basically got the same resolution, the same image being magnified larger and being diffraction limited due to that additional magnification. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm following along so far.
You can see each one of those, the f2.8 400 millimeter, the 600-4, and the 800-5.6, just step right along. Basically, those three lenses or those scales, 2.8 to 600-4 to 800-5.6, are exactly one stop because they all have the same sized physical aperture, basically, essentially. So they're all letting the same amount of light through, and it's just being magnified and spread out more at the sensor side. And that's all a teleconverter does. It creates a longer focal length by adding more powerful telephoto elements behind the other portion of the lens. That makes sense.
Yeah, I'm trying to deduce now in terms of, so if I'm at 6.3 on that 800,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be down into I'm guessing I'm going to be down somewhere in the low 30s on the red wavelength.
Probably, yeah. Low
Right?
30s, some probably in the 40s for the greens, and
Yeah.
way more than you need on blues.
Right. And so my image quality by comparison to a 500 PF f6 or my 400 2.8 or 600 f4, if I could get close enough to the subject, would render me better image quality than the 800 would.
If you could get closer, absolutely. And if you can't get closer, it'll render about the same end result. And after cropping and enlarging the sensor area to the same output size, you'll end up close to the same. That, of course, is comparing lenses of the same generation, the same technology. And so it gets really difficult if you're comparing, say, a 400F lens to a Z mount lens, because you jumped technology in generation.
I think the real world question, and I've had a few folks asking me is, and budget aside, do I buy the 400 2.8 and put a 2x teleconverter on at 5.6 to get to 800, or do you buy that and then I've got a more versatile lens, being able to shoot at 400 2.8 and drop in the 1.4 and shoot at 560 and so on, or do I buy the 800 6.3 if I'm going to be shooting most of my wildlife where I require that reach?
If it were me, I would use the 400 2.8 with its built-in TC, because, like I said, adding a TC just makes a prime lens a telephoto lens. It takes your 400 prime and makes it an 800 millimeter telephoto.
Right.
Okay, that's why they're called converters. But the difference is the built-in converters optimized for that optical formula. It was designed to be there. The whole lens was designed for that TC to be added and removed.
Right. And so I guess the question everyone's asking is, does the external TC degrade image quality such that I would want to have that prime lens at 6.3 at 800 millimeters?
It's hard to say. My TCs, I went through like 3 or 4 2x teleconverters to use on my 400 2.8 to find one that was a better match to the lens. Like if you bought the F mount 800 5.6, it came with a 1.4 TC serial number match to the lens.
Okay.
And so that TC was optimized for that lens. So when you're adding external TCs, it's kind of luck of the draw. Do the errors add up, or do the errors cancel each other out? Do you get a better result or a worse result or a neutral result? But I don't think with the high resolution sensors, I don't think there's really a big benefit to that, because as I explained, when you add the 2x TC on the 400 2.8, you just made it an 800 5.6. You've reduced the light, you've reduced the depth of field, you've reduced the resolution due to diffraction increasing. So you have more megapixels on less resolution, so it cancels out. So like if we look at this, let's use the red wavelengths, I guess, is probably where we want to be. If I take the 2.8, 400 2.8, I'm at 151 megapixels in reds, way more than I can use on a 46 megapixel. I put the 1.4x built in, I'm at 74, still way more than I can use on the 46 megapixel sensor. Then when I get to 5.6, I'm down to 38. So I've diffraction limited the lens to less than the sensor can resolve. And these numbers on this chart assume a perfect lens. So the actual numbers could be less than that. And with a 2x TC, they're almost certainly going to be less than what's on this chart. External TC.
Right. So for folks shooting with, for example, the 100 to 400 and putting a 2x teleconverter on it, you're now at f11. What I see across this table then is I have a 45 megapixel Z9 camera, but I'm only getting, 30, 16, and 10 on those. I get 10 megapixels in the red wavelength.
That's true. That's true.
Okay.
I think it's worth noting, and I'll go to this section here.
I don't think a lot of people understand that, right? That you think that, hey, I have a 45 megapixel camera, so it doesn't matter what TCs, what lenses I put on, I've got a 45 megapixel image.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to think you get 46 megapixels of resolution, regardless of what you put in front of it. And it really makes no sense. You have technique, you have lens resolution as limited by technique, and you have sensor resolution as limited by technique, and you get whichever is the least.
Right.
And I like to use, I can have a picture of a blank white wall. I can use 1 megapixel to replicate that, or I can use 46 megapixels to replicate it. It'll still look the same. It's a plain white wall. And the same goes as if the scene in front is blurry due to motion, camera shake, or subject motion, or out of focus, or whatever, you don't get the full resolution. But the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that you don't really need 46 megapixels most of the time worth of resolution. And this is a DxO sharpness map for the older Nikon 80 to 400 G lens, and you can see that their scale for resolution stops at 12. They don't bother really, they measure higher. In their report, they'll tell you what the resolution is above 12, but the scale only goes to 12. And that's because the standard criteria for sharpness is way less than 12 megapixels. And what you can see as a human with average eyesight in an image, when you're looking at an image as a whole, so meaning you have this image displayed and it's in your primary field of view, you're viewing it from a distance about equal to the diagonal, the whole circle of confusion standards, you can't see more than 12 to 14 megapixels worth of resolution as a human. And that's because the dots are there, they're just too small. It's like looking at your monitor right now.
Right.
All right, I'm going to bring you back up. So what else can I say about that?
Well, one of the things that when I was looking at that chart, is it true that I can get a sharper image by going from f4? Like a lot of people say, hey, when I'm shooting birds in flight, I go f8 so I get more depth of field and keep the eye sharp. Mm-hmm. Is it better to be to stop it down that way, or to shoot with your lens wide open? From a pure sharpness perspective, I know depth of field is going to be less when I go f4 versus f8, but from a sharpness on the eye of the bird, which would you prefer?
Well, that really depends, because in the bird in flight, when you increase the focal length, you've increased the relative speed of this subject. Its eye is covering more part of the sensor, a larger area of the sensor, and a little bit of motion makes it cover another larger portion of the sensor, and it'll leave the sensor quicker. So the relative speed is faster, which makes it more probable that you're going to record blur just due to the extra magnification. Does that make sense?
Yeah, now you're talking focal length or aperture opening?
Focal length.
Focal
first.
length.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then with the aperture, you have the ability for the lens to be sharper due to diffraction. And at the wider aperture, you have the ability to have a higher shutter speed or a lower ISO. So a lot of times you will be as well off, or maybe slightly better off, using the shorter focal length and cropping in after the fact, as long as you have enough resolution remaining, actual image resolution remaining, to output the kind of image you want.
With better bokeh and so on for those images.
Well, no. I figured this topic was going to come up, so I did get a picture for this. All right.
Excellent. As I've always tried to shoot more wide open to get that blurred background that I prefer. So
when we're comparing crop versus not crop, basically, because we're looking at the 800 5.63 versus options we might have available otherwise. So here's the 800, and then 6.4 was the closest this depth of field calculator had.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And I've got this out at 1,000 inches. So the report's in nice, easy numbers. 1,000 inches is about 85 feet, just under 85 feet. So not as long as you might be, but longer than you want to be, further away than you usually want to be. All right. So on a full frame sensor, doesn't matter what size resolution the sensor has in these calculations. At 800 6.4, we get 14.6 inches depth of field.
Okay.
All right. If I use the 400 2.8, I instead get 26.5 inches. So much less separation, as you're calling it, right?
Right.
Much more depth of field. But if I crop this 400 2.8 by either using the twice longer focal length or by using a crop sensor or by cropping in post, similar to, and I'm using a 2x crop here because we're comparing 400 to the 800.
Yeah.
So I'm using a 2x crop body. I end up with relatively the same depth of field as I do up here.
Yeah.
So what cropping does change the depth of field because it assumes that the output image is going to be the same size. So when we're talking 1024 display on a website or a 24-inch print, that's what we're talking about, the depth of field in that output.
Okay.
As long as they're the same sizes, outputs. Depth of field is not a fixed aspect of an image. It's variable. It's based upon how you perceive the image and how sharp you perceive it to be.
That table or what you just reviewed actually is, I would say, the opposite of how I was thinking about it. That if I had a 400 2.8 versus an 800 6.4, I would have a more blurred background with the 400 2.8 than I would with the 800.
No. When it comes down to depth of field, subject distance and focal length, basically magnification, has twice the impact on depth of field that aperture does.
Interesting. Well, I'm learning a lot this morning. I hope our viewers are as well.
Yeah, no, if you really want shallow depth of field, then the key there is getting close, higher magnification, whether it's the focal length or getting closer, and then having that background separation, having it further away. The subject. Right. That makes way more difference than the aperture selection.
Yeah, which we don't often have the choice from hey, can I get this background further away? Sometimes we can, and I think you've done it with a lot of your birds where that background's out of focus. You choose the background and perch or where you think the bird might land, because you have the background further back and you know that it'll be a nice soft bokeh versus, okay, I'm just going to follow this bird wherever it happens to go.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of moving a foot.
You're right.
One way or the other.
Right.
Sometimes you don't have a choice. And then, right. If you don't have a choice, then it becomes a question of, do you really want that picture?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think we discussed on our panel discussion there, it's a question of, hey, if it's your first time shooting this subject and you're really just trying to get a picture of the bird, that's one thing. If you've got pictures already, then start to think about backgrounds and how that photo will render itself at the end of the day, and find the background, stay in place, and wait for the bird to come to you.
Yep, build a portfolio and make it better.
Exactly. Yeah, I've got enough Me Too images in my portfolios. Time to get a little bit creative and start thinking about things like backgrounds and depth of field and so on. Okay, so hand holding the 800. I mean, I saw the images coming from Steve and Rishi, and I mean, the images looked great. It depends, I think, what you're going to be using them for and print and so on and so forth. But both of them are very bullish on that lens and going to be using it handheld. The scientific data would suggest, yeah, you're getting less megapixels, but as we discussed the other night, on our panel discussion, I'm shooting 120 frames per second to get different wing positions, and I only have 11 megapixels.
Yeah, and that all goes back to that sharpness chart I showed that tops out at 12.
Right.
We're using 46 megapixel sensors, but we almost never get 46 megapixels recorded. It's essentially theoretically impossible to record 46 megapixels with a 46 megapixel sensor.
Well, unless I see this chart would suggest that your 2.8 or f4 lens would, correct?
It could, but you have to those because there's so much more resolution from the lens that it's maxing out, and that goes to this other chart I have. It's in these pictures. It's this one. Back when we read the D3. And we were basically sensor limited in resolution. It made a lot more sense to use longer focal lengths because there's really no penalty to having the greater magnification and extra diffraction due to the smaller aperture. So I get 11 and 10 on the 12 megapixel sensor. But as resolution of the lenses increases, you start paying a penalty for the extra magnification, the blur, and the diffraction. Here at the D810 range, 36 megapixels.
Yeah,
you're still getting 33 with the 402.8, but you're only getting 24 at 604. You're starting to pay a penalty for that diffraction and magnification. And then up here at 46, I'm still getting 40 with the 2.8, but I'm only getting 26 with a 604. Now, this isn't, a like for like comparison. It's like for like in the Nikon FG series lenses, right. But I can't really say this applies to, say, the 400, 600 to 800 S VR lens. All right, so but the simple fact is the 806.3 is going to render less resolution than a 402.8 S lens and then with this 1.4, it's going to be in this range, right? Now, the one thing to note about this though is although I am losing resolution, it's not quite as much as I would lose if I cropped this 40 megapixel image.
That's going to be my next question is, so given what I see on this chart, am I better to have, let's say for folks who own a 500 PF better to crop in on that image or be using the 800?
I think better is not
the right word.
Not really the right word. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
If in this scenario here, I've got the 400-2.8 that's giving me 40 megapixels versus a 604 that's giving me 26. Now this is essentially, the 600 is essentially a DX crop of the 400-2.8, right? A 1.5 crop, and 1.5 crop is 50% area. So I would expect a DX crop of this image to give me about 20 megapixels. But if I do it using a lens, I get 26. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so the lens has a little bit of an advantage there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But 20 versus 26 is still way more than I generally need.
Right.
So the point of that is that the 604 gives me a slight benefit, but it's very likely it's not much of a benefit, not as much as you would think it is. I wouldn't say it's generally a $6,000 benefit if I don't need that resolution. And you know, the cropping when you have a high resolution sensor, if the technique and the settings you use in the shutter speed and lower ISO allows you to get a higher quality image on the high resolution sensor, you can crop it and end up in about the same spot, not better off, not a better image result, probably technically slightly worse image result, but more than adequate.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm landing is how many megapixels do I actually need in order to render an image that I can print? Right. And 20 is perfectly fine.
If we go back, it should be perfectly fine. Absolutely.
Yeah, I go back to our, you know, you brought up the D3, and I've shot with the D3, D3S, D4. I mean, when we were shooting 12 megapixels, you know, it was just fine to blow that up into something we could print.
I think the whole 300 pixel print requirement for printing has really convoluted things. I went back to that depth of field chart because I was hoping it showed the circle of confusion standard that it's applied based on. When you use a depth of field calculator or the depth of field scale on an old film lens, that's based upon, for a full frame camera, a circle of confusion of 30 microns, which is an airy disc that we first talked about, the diffraction limited point on the sensor being 30 microns in size. All right. That means that one detail on the sensor is covering 49 pixels. The COC standard for sharpness, acceptable sharpness and depth of field in a print for any size print is less than 2 megapixels. That's why those depth of field calculators don't ever consider how much resolution a sensor has as to whether or not the image is going to be sharp enough or not, because every sensor has way more than you need for that standard. Now, it's very arguable, debatable that is that 30 micron COC standard applicable these days? Is it? I would say it's very underrated for digital display because people can zoom in so large and over zoom. But even if we change that standard to base it upon human vision, it tops out around 14 megapixels for any size displayed print, as long as it's viewed from an appropriate distance. So we're going back to, do you have enough if you crop? And most of the time you do. And if you don't have enough for printing, Like your images are starting to pixelate at whatever output size you want. You're starting to see square pixels in your image. Then you can use a resampling, a resizing to make all the squares smaller so you can't see them anymore.
Are you referring to something like a Topaz gigapixel, something to that?
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be that advanced, really.
Yeah, okay.
You're just making the square smaller so you can't see them again. It's like your monitor. I don't know what monitor you have. I have one of the latest Retinas, XDR liquid things or whatever it's called. But it runs at about 230 pixels per inch.
Right.
But I have it double sampling, so I'm running it at about 110, 120 pixels per inch. And I can't see the pixels. They're smaller than I can see. So I don't know why everyone's so insistent they need 300 per inch to print them on an inkjet printer. The dots bleed and stuff. Most of the time, what I'm saying is 12 megapixels. If you can record an actual 12 megapixels of resolution, you've got enough to do almost anything with.
Okay. So to take this into the real world, because I think at the end of the day, people want to know, okay, should I be buying this 800 6.3? So in the scenario where I shoot wildlife, I need the reach. I always ask the question of the experts, what would you do? So maybe you already own a 6, and leave budget aside, but if you could pick one lens, whether that be the 600, the 400 2.8, the 800 6.3, the 500 PF, and so on and so forth, is it worth buying the new 800 or the 400, or what lens would you choose when you require? Would you crop with one of the lesser millimeter lenses, or would you choose the 800?
Well, first I want to go back to the beginning and say that when we're in photography, pretty much everything we're doing is some form of cropping. If I use a longer focal length, it's just cropping the scene in front down to a smaller field of view and then magnifying it more. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If I crop it in post or use a crop sensor and output it at the same size, I'm doing the same thing. I'm cropping the scene and magnifying it more. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So a longer lens doesn't get me more reach as such. It gets me a crop and more magnification. And way back here, where there was no penalty for the extra magnification because we were sensor limited, it makes sense. Over here, where we're lens limited, or we become more and more lens limited because we have such high resolution sensors, it makes less sense now. The extra magnification doesn't help. I can do it in post,
right,
with almost the same result.
Yeah.
All right. So when we're going to the, what would I buy the 800 6.3? If budget was not an issue, I would buy the 400 2.8 with its built-in and matched teleconverter.
Mm-hmm. It's
more versatile. It has the ability to do 2.8 when I need light, or I need a higher shutter speed. I can use it at a closer distance and not cut off my subject. Because 800 millimeters, it's great when you need the reach, but when it's too long and you can't do anything about it.
Yeah, that's one of the scenarios. And I think it totally depends on what subjects you shoot. For me, the 600 millimeter FL is pretty much my go-to 90% of the time, and sometimes I'm throwing a 1.4 on it, but 600 is just about right for most of what I shoot. So 800's probably, as you say, I got to back up in order to get that subject in the frame the way I want it, as opposed to throwing on a 1.4 when I need the reach. And I'm hearing you say now, hey, I can take my 600 millimeter lens and just crop in post and be fine. No need to trade up to the 800 or trade that 600 for the 800.
You'll probably be fine. You'll probably have more than enough. Like the there's some variables. Generally speaking, you would have a little better result with the longer lens than cropping.
Yeah.
But now we're talking a lens that's not at a comparable aperture. It's a third stop slower. Yeah. We're talking about a lens that's a PF lens, phase Fresnel lens, and I haven't seen the results comparisons yet, but every other PF lens Nikon's made has a tendency to have really weird bokeh in certain situations because of the texture element that the Fresnel lens has. So that would be a negative. It's definitely much lower resolution than a 400-2.8 can be.
Right.
But if you compare it to, say, the 100-400 for the Z cameras, that's a 6.3 lens. All right. So using the 800 6.3, I'm just going to use a 5.6 number. This 800 5.6 would have 2 stops advantage over the 400 5.6 cropped, 400 6.3 cropped. And well, yeah, the 800 6.3 will have 2 stop light advantage. And the reason that is just due to the greater magnification. The 800 6.3 actually has a larger physical aperture opening. It lets more light through than the 400 6.3 does. So when that results in the same exposure for both. So imagine taking a picture of a light bulb. With the 400 6.3, it's smaller on the sensor. With the 800 6.3, it's twice as large on the sensor, equally bright, but twice as large at the same brightness is more light. So that's going to be a higher quality image of the light bulb.
Right.
And so if I crop the lower one on the 400 and magnify it so it's output at the same size, it's going to have a 2-stop disadvantage in noise due to the amount of light recorded. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So if I compare it to the 400-2.8, the 400-2.8's got an advantage or slight advantage because it's more than 2 stops wider than 6.3. So it's getting more than 2 stops just slightly. So when I crop that one and expand it, I end up about the same spot. Okay, so of the S mount lenses options, I guess that's Z mount. They have the S series lens, Z mount lenses. My choice would be the 400-2.8 with its matched TC. All right.
And for the budget conscious, because not everybody I know in Canada, that lens is about $20,000. So
absolutely.
For the budget,
I'm not going to buy it. I'm not
yeah.
going to buy it because I've got a 400-2.8 already.
Right.
You know, and it works fine adapted. So
yeah.
Unless something else happens where I find a need, I have to have it, which is not going to happen. I'm not buying that lens either. The 100-400 seems to be a really good lens.
Yes.
And you can crop it and probably have enough. Almost, you're not going to be as well off. You're going to have a disadvantage, 2-stop disadvantage over the 800. But the question is that worth, $6,000-8,000 to you? Yes.
Yeah, I've been using the 100-400 and more so with the 1.4 than the 2 times, which I think pulls out to 560 on the 1.4. And I find the image quality perfectly acceptable with images or subjects that are close enough to me.
Like I said, I think the 800 of what's available in native S mount, Z mount, the 805-63 offers a lot at the price. And it is going to be notably better than using the 100 to 400 for the same thing at the same distances, if you need the extra reach. But it's not going to be notably better than the 400 2.8. It'll probably be worse, but it's also a lot cheaper and a little bit lighter.
Yep.
And yeah, if you have f-mount lenses that work well adapted, you know, then is it really worth going that way either? I don't think the 800-63 is in my price range, but I don't think I'm going to buy it.
Yeah.
All right. Because I have f-mount options that are working well.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm the same. I have my 600 f4 FL lens, and I'm thinking the same thing. When I need the extra reach, I'll put the 1.4 on it, but I don't know. I don't. 800 is just not a range that I shoot at a lot, and therefore, as you say, it's limiting because I'm going to have to back up. I can't get further away from the subject many times in the time frame that I require to get the shot. So I'd rather put a TC on to get the reach than to try to back up. But that's
just a lot of times when you're using focal length to make up for not being able to get close enough, it means you're shooting through a lot more atmosphere.
Yeah.
You know, so
heat waves,
or humidity, smog, whatever.
Yeah.
It tends to degrade images at longer focal lengths because you're at longer distances.
Yeah.
So there's that negative. Longer focal lengths, like I said, a longer focal length is just another version of cropping. And sometimes it's not a better version. This just shows that as focal lengths increase due to diffraction, the depth of the resolution always goes down due to the diffraction thing.
Yeah. Okay.
This shows that this is an 800 millimeter image taken handheld, and this is 200% zooms, 400% zoom. So it's not good at 400%, but it's good at 200.
Right.
All right.
And is that due to motion blur?
Sure, probably handshake.
Yeah.
I mean,
okay.
Motion blur. When you see an image and you say it's sharp, it doesn't mean there's no motion blur. It just means the motion blur is less than you can see at the size you're looking at the image. It's the same with depth of field. Because an image looks sharp, it just really means that it's small enough, the image is presented small enough to look sharp. But this next image we're taking at 400 millimeter handheld. And here we're at 400% zoom. This is a D5 image. And you can still see the hairs of the eyelash on this elk. You can see how zoomed in it is.
Yeah.
You can see the details in the eye on the sandhill crane at 400% zoom. So the point is, I can crop this in and be as well off or better off than I am with 800 millimeter handheld images. Because being able to zoom in farther every time it's twice, that's 4 times as much actual image resolution was recorded. And that does bring me up to one other thing, that because you're going to see a lot of reviews and they talk about how good it looks and how far you can zoom in on the image and have it look great. This is that same image. This is a screen grab of that same image. This time it's at 800% zoom. So this is a 400 2.8 image.
Yeah.
800% zoom. The only thing I did here was I changed my monitor resolution setting. So instead of having it run at its native pixel doubling, I went to a higher resolution setting so the image at 100% is smaller on the screen. So now I can zoom in twice as far,
Right.
and it still looks the same. So the point of this is when you're seeing people talk about how far they can zoom in and how great it looks and stuff, you'd have to know what resolution their monitor is.
Monitors, yeah.
For that to actually mean something definitive.
Right.
You know.
That allows, our viewers, certainly the scientific data, to make the decisions around where they want to put their money in terms of lenses, right? It's just that 800 millimeter is such a hot lens. The pre-orders, are going through the roof on it. And I just wanted to lend some, especially for those who are on a budget who might be craving that lens, some of the scientific data to suggest that there are other options.
When you have a high resolution sensors, the Z7 and the Z9 is, if you can record a higher resolution image by using a wider aperture, better shutter speed, that kind of thing, you can crop and end up in about the same spot,
right,
as using a longer lens.
Yeah.
So that's the thing I don't think most people realize, is that once you get 46 megapixels up there, you can discard quite a lot and still be really well off, as long as you actually record the image resolution. Megapixels don't matter as much as what you recorded. Goes back to the beginning. Technique limited, lens limited, or sensor limited, whichever is lowest is what you get. And we're generally technique or lens limited at 46 megapixels now.
All right. Well, with that, I think I have no further questions. I hope that gives our viewers enough of a review and data analysis to make some decisions about what lens they'll be buying. And certainly, for me at least, versatility comes into play as well. That 800 is a long lens. If that's what you need for shooting, then great. If you need to be able to take in more of the scene and the landscapes and so on and so forth, those shorter lenses, I still think those are in your bag. Steve Perry mentioned, hey, he's still going to carry a 100 to 400, even if he has the 800 in his bag for that extra reach. So I want to thank you, Steven, for joining us today and bringing us this review. Sure.
And what other way I can be of any help, let me know.
I will do that. Thank you very much.
All right.
Have a great day. You too. Bye-bye. Sharing this content with you is so much fun for me. If you want to help support the channel, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, bang on the alert button, share it out, or give us a comment. It all helps, and it's much appreciated.